I suspect maybe a little bit lost on us for the same reason as this morning. Do you know what a capital is? It's the bit that goes on top of a pillar. And they don't really help us so much, our Bible translations sometimes. I think sometimes what you want to do is just go online and find some pictures, which is what I did. And they're working this afternoon. So would you like to see the ones you missed this morning first? Okay, so I'm going to show you, this is the temple at what's the name of the place again? Ayan Dara, I think. So this is the temple. You can see there's not a lot left of it, but there's enough there that you can clearly determine the kind of shape and the purpose of the building and the function of the building. And I'll show you in a minute, kind of zoomed in, but can you already see in this top right one, you can already see a cherub, right? Can you see that on the stone? On the top left one, just to the right of the steps up. So there's that pillar that's been cut off, and there's that stone at the bottom, and there's a kind of a half bull, half lion thing kind of standing there engraved in the stone. Can you see that? Yeah, so this is the temple. It would have been located quite close to Hiram of Tyre's homeland. This was the kind of cultural world that Solomon lived in. If we go to the next one, I'll show you the footprints. There they are. So these are not modern. These are ancient. The ancient people kind of put them there because they like to imagine that this was the place where their god came home to, and that's a god-sized foot. And there's another one. So that's the two, and then the one, and then the next one's up those steps there at the end of the picture on the top. The next picture is cherubs from various cultures. The one at the top right is actually from Ayan Dara. That's the cherub that stands guarding that temple, or one of the cherubs that stands guarding that temple. This one, the other two are Mesopotamian. They're not from the same place. And they're actually a lot later in history, but they're the ones that I've seen in person. And these are from the palace of Sennacherib, the Assyrian king in the 8th century. But you can see the idea, right? You have a big statue, it's kind of got wings and looks like a bull and a human head, and it looks scary, and it guards places. That's the gist of cherubs. This is what you should be imagining when somebody talks about cherubim. Yeah, not little fat babies, unfortunately. Cherub, it comes from a Hebrew word, just straight out of it's a transliteration, and it means near. So cherubim are the near ones. They're the ones who are near to God. And we'll come back to that idea in just a minute, because we'll need that. Okay, if you go to the next one, this is just kind of, I was going to put this up when we were talking about going back into God's presence, right? The whole journey into the temple is designed to kind of mimic a journey back into the presence of God in the garden. The top one is a terrible picture, but there you go. The journey back to God's presence. We'll come back to that just now too. And I think, what we'll do is we'll show the video. Can we show the video? Okay, so what I need you to just remember that nobody actually knows what Solomon's temple looks like. All we've got really is this text that we've just been reading. So if you want to imagine what Solomon's temple looks like, then what you've got to do is work through 1 Kings 6 and 1 Kings 7 very carefully and figure out what all of those different words mean, and kind of figure out how much a cubit is and how much a bath is and all of those different things. And then you can kind of imagine for yourself. So people have done the hard work of this and kind of imagined for themselves what Solomon's temple would have looked like. But you've got to remember, this is one interpretation, okay? So it's not the final authority. I wouldn't want you to think that I'm showing you a video. All right, so what we're going to do is just zoom our way into the temple. Can we put that up? It only goes for a couple of minutes. And perhaps as we go, you'll notice the garden motifs we were talking about this morning, and you'll see some of the things we were just reading in 1 Kings 7 then as well. So this is the altar where you'd sacrifice for sin. We can leave the sound off and then I can talk. This is the bronze basin it was talking about, sitting on the backs of 12 bulls. It holds 44,000 litres of water. And these are the smaller basins, which were engraved with, it's not going to come up, it's not quite so bright, but there are cherubs and lions and things there. And as you walk towards the temple, those are the pillars. They're not there to hold up the roof. They're entirely decorative. Notice that they're shaped like trees. There were pomegranates and things, and here we go into the temple. And again, the garden motifs we were noticing this morning, the cherubs, the trees, the leaves. And as you walk in, it's higher than you can reasonably look up into. This is the holy place. You'll notice some of the things we were reading about there that Solomon made, the 10 golden lampstands or menorah. This is the decorations on the walls, the cherubs there. The table is the table for the showbread, or the bread of the presence. These are the windows, the lattice work, the lily flowers, the kind of ornate carving. Everything here is gold. The bread is not gold, but everything else is gold. And that's the altar of incense. It kind of stands there. We'll talk about that in a minute. Notice where it's standing. Where everything is very important. And then you go up into the most holy place, where you're greeted with two enormous cherubs that stand 4 meters high each, and underneath their wings is the Ark of the Covenant with its own cherubs sitting on top of the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, now everything is quite carefully arranged, and the purpose is, as we were talking about this morning, to imagine bringing you back into the presence of God. Now, in our passage that we just read then, so this was just straight off YouTube. You could have found this for yourself. In that passage we were just reading then, there were two groups of things, and I hope you didn't get lost. There was a bronze group of things, did you notice? And there was a gold group of things. So all the bronze stuff is the stuff that goes outside the temple, and all the gold stuff is the stuff that goes inside the temple. And Huram, don't get confused, not Hiram, not the king, Huram, the bronze craftsman, Huram of Tyre, made all of the bronze things, and that includes all of those things outside the temple that we were just looking at. And Solomon looked after all of the things that went into the temple. At the front of the temple, you notice the two big pillars. There was Yakin, so they were named. Okay, so these are quite big. You could stretch kind of 4 people. If you got 4 people my size and reached around, then you would touch hands. So they're quite large pillars, and they were named. Yakin in Hebrew means he will establish. And Boaz in Hebrew means with strength. And so the two pillars read, because Hebrew reads right to left, they read, he will establish with strength. And the idea, again, it's creation, right? It's about God establishing his creation with strength. He'll establish his purposes. He'll establish what he intends to do. When you went inside the temple, did you notice there were 2 rooms? There's a place called the Holy Place, and there's a place called the Holy of Holies, or the Most Holy Place. How do you understand holiness? What does it mean? Set apart. Nearly everyone always says set apart. It's not too bad. It's not, it's not going to help us too much. Could we actually, while I'm talking, maybe could you just put the picture of the Sidon temple up, and people can just, so we can see the whole thing at once. No, not that one, the picture. So in the slides. Next one, I think. That one. Okay. So basically, you can see the entire thing as you start at the front and work your way through. And we'll just have that there, and you can gaze at it while I talk. Okay, holiness is more about. It's more about whose company you're ready to keep. So the Old Testament has these three categories of, I don't really know what to call it. We'll call it three categories of holiness. And you will have heard these words, holy and clean and unclean. Do you know these words? And maybe sometimes when we hear those words, people associate them with being sinful or being not sinful. And holiness would be not sinful and unclean would be. It's not really quite how it works. Okay, in the Old Testament, what these categories mean are they're like whose company you're ready for. Okay, so if you're clean, what that means is that you're suitable for just society. You're suitable for everyday working with people, doing stuff, everything's good. We're okay in each other's company. If you're holy, it means you're okay in God's company. If you're unclean, it means you're not even okay in the company of each other. Right? So it's actually a very symbolic kind of world that they live in. And you can move between these things. How do you go from being unclean to being clean? Do you know? Yeah, there are only two ways really. You can wash, or there's time. So sometimes the uncleanness rubs off after time. It's not about sin. It's a symbol. How do you go from being clean to unclean? What are some of the things you can do? Touch a dead thing. Yep, if you touch a dead thing, you don't sin if you touch a dead thing. People in Israel still had to kill meat and still had to bury dead bodies and all. Becoming unclean isn't about sinning. It's not a sin category, right? It's a symbol category. There are lots of ways. If you kind of bleed or if you have a discharge of any kind, pus or, anything at all, then you'd be unclean. There's lots of different things that can make you unclean. And you can be cleaned by taking time, or you can wash. How do you go from being clean to being holy? Sacrifice. Right, you have to kill something. How do you go from being holy to being unclean? You touch something, right. So that's important, right? If something holy comes into contact with something unclean, what happens? The holy thing becomes unclean. If something holy comes into contact with something unclean, but the holy thing can't become unclean because it's God, what happens?
Actually makes me touching it holy.
No, it doesn't.
And so the difference is if they touch this, it becomes holy.
It becomes holy.
Yeah.
Normally, if you're unclean and you touch something holy, you die. If the holy thing can't become unclean. Right? So this is basically the system. So what we've got here is not just a journey back to God. We've got a journey that tells us what we're going to have to do to get back to God. And we've got a whole system of things in place to make sure that we don't get there before we're ready. Right, this morning we were talking about the temple as a promise and the temple as a problem. And I've got a third one. The temple is also a paradox. Because God moves in and dwells amongst his people and then puts up cherubs to keep them out and smoke to obscure the vision and a most holy place that people can't go into and a holy place that people can't go into. There's a whole system here to make sure that you don't end up at God when he's going to kill you. You read this morning, what happened when people came into the presence of God? They died, they fell on their face as if dead, the whole way through the Bible. This wasn't just an Old Testament thing. Did you get to the New Testament people too? Yeah, this is a human problem kind of thing, right? When people find themselves in the presence of a holy God, they fall down dead throughout the Bible. So the temple's designed to show you that God wants to be with you and at the same time to keep you as far away from God as possible. The altar of incense, do you remember where it was? Right, in the center. And it just had a little whiff of smoke. It's symbolic, of course it is. But the whole point is to obscure your vision so that you don't actually accidentally catch a sight of God. It reminds you of the cloud that God appears in, right? You don't sacrifice on that altar. That's not for sacrifice. That's to produce smoke. So you don't accidentally see God and die. The entire thing is designed to keep you away. And what do you have to do? It's like, why build a house in the middle of your people that's designed to push your people as far away as possible? It's a paradox. What do you have to do to get back to God in this system? Where do you have to walk? Okay, so you come in the front, and the first thing is the altar of sacrifice. We're going to have to deal with your sin. So we're going to offer a sacrifice, and we're going to look at how that works in just a minute. We're going to have to deal with your sin. So we'll offer a sacrifice. I'm not actually sure this picture is entirely accurate, actually. I think maybe you hit the basin first, but it doesn't really matter. The basin, wash. Symbolically, I don't think anybody's actually climbing in there, right? Because it's like this tall. It's not the point. The whole thing is symbols. You have to deal with symbols if you're going to read a passage like this. Okay, you wash. You become clean. You become holy. Once you're cleansed, once your sin has been dealt with, then you're ready to enter back into the presence of God. Then you're ready. So then you can walk up between the two enormous pillars and into the front of the temple. I've been told I'm not allowed to wander over that way anymore. But that's where the temple is. In my mind, then you're ready to wander into the presence of God. Then you can go back to the garden. What's going to happen if you go in the temple before you wash and before you're made holy? You're going to die. What happens to people who mistreat the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament? They die. They fall over dead. Have you noticed how unfair it is? Uzziah, do you know the story of Uzziah? And they're transporting the ark on the oxen, and the oxen slips, and he reaches out his hand to touch the ark to stabilize it so it doesn't fall over, and drops dead. David gets angry with God at that too. But the point is, if you do any of these things in the wrong order, you die, because we are not fit to be in the presence of God. So if this is a journey back to God, then this is a journey of dealing with our problem and showing us and teaching Israel in the first place and teaching us what it's going to take to restore the fellowship that God created us to have in the first place and to overcome that paradox. You with me? Do you understand? The whole thing is a symbol. Now I want to show you how that sacrifice works. There's actually a lot of different laws, a lot of different places in the Old Testament we could go to. But I'd like you to turn to Leviticus 16. This is called the Day of Atonement. And I'm just going to work through this a little bit with you and show you what's going on here on the Day of Atonement. This isn't the only time Israel deals with their sin. This isn't the only laws about sin. This is once a year. They have this special day when they're going to make atonement for themselves, where they're going to reconcile themselves back to God again, and they're going to restore the relationship and make up for the sin of the previous year. It's part of a festival. Leviticus 16, are you there? I'm not there. You're there, I'm not there. Okay, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron who died when they approached the Lord. Okay, so this is what we've been reading about. This is what we've been talking about, sorry. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron that he's not to come whenever he chooses into the most holy place behind the curtain." Now, of course, at this point they don't have the temple, they have the tabernacle. And the tabernacle, as you will have discovered this morning, is just like the temple, only portable. Okay, tell your brother Aaron that he's not to come whenever he chooses into the most holy place behind the curtain in front of the atonement cover on the ark, or else he'll die. For I will appear in the cloud over the atonement cover. What is God's throne in the Old Testament? In heaven, yes, it does say he's enthroned in heaven, but that's not what I'm looking for. What is his earthly throne? God is enthroned where? On the cherubim. On the cherubim. In the temple, these two massive statues, this is God's throne room. Tell Aaron he can't go in there anytime he likes or else he'll die. I'll appear in a cloud over the atonement cover. The atonement cover is the cover on the top of the Ark of the Covenant. This is how Aaron is to enter the most holy place. He must first bring a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He's to put on the sacred linen tunic with linen undergarments next to his body. He's to tie the linen sash around him and put on the linen turban. These are sacred garments, so he must bathe himself with water before he puts them on. From the Israelite community, he is to take 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. Okay, so he's actually got 2 sets of offerings to make. He's got to make an offering for himself. Why? He's a high priest. That's not why he has to offer for himself. Because he's a sinner. Okay, part of the flaw in this whole sacrificial system is there's nobody around who's not a sinner to walk into the presence of God and do the offering. If you're going to make up for sin, you've got to put blood on the atonement cover. And you can't go in there because you can't make up for sin. Okay, he's going to do 2 sets of offering. One for himself, he's going to cleanse himself with water, and he's going to do an offering for the people. Aaron's to offer the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household. Where does he do that? Right, so he offers the bull here. He's offering it for himself and his household. He's to take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He's to cast lots for the 2 goats. Actually, I'm just going to skip to 11 because you kind of get the same thing told twice. Aaron shall bring the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household. He's to slaughter the bull for his own sin offering. He's to take a censer full of burning coals from the altar before the Lord and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense and take them behind the curtain. He's to put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the smoke of the incense will conceal the atonement cover above the tablets of the covenant law so that he will not die. Okay, you don't get to look at God in the Old Testament and live. So what does he have to do? He has to grab something that's going to make smoke, incense. And he carries it in there, and he puts it on the altar of incense before the atonement cover, so that there's a lot of smoke so that he can't see what he's doing. Because he's a sinner and he's not ready to be in God's presence. Now again, the problem. What's the problem? The problem isn't God. Right? It's not because God is the creator and we are creatures. Right? That can't be the problem. We learned that this morning, right? God was creator and we were creatures before the fall and everything was cool. We were chilling together. Right, what's the problem? Sin is the problem. Sin is the problem. Okay, so he can't do that. He has to take a censer full of burning coals from the altar before the Lord. I'm in verse 13. He's to put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the smoke of the incense will conceal the atonement cover above the tablets of the covenant law so that he'll not die. He's to take some of the bull's blood, this is the sacrifice for himself, and with his finger he sprinkles it on the atonement cover. And he sprinkles it with his finger 7 times on the atonement cover. And having done that, his own sin, symbolically, is paid for. The incense is not for good smellingness. The incense is to make smoke.
It does smell good.
It does. But that's not its purpose. Its purpose is so that it obscures your vision, because you shouldn't be looking at God. And again, what we're doing here is operating in a system of symbols, right? It's a symbolic world. It's not literally that there's so much incense that you can't see anything and Aaron would have tears running down his face. And, it's a symbolic thing, okay? He's symbolically obscuring the presence of God so that symbolically he doesn't see God and die. And the point of all of this is he's not ready to make atonement. He can't go into God's presence to make atonement because he's a sinner himself. And so he has to do everything he can to shield himself from God's presence and make sure he doesn't get too close to God. The temple is designed to keep him away until he's ready. And once atonement's made, then he can do the other stuff. Once he's ready for God's presence, once he's holy, then he can manage everybody else's sin, which is what happens next in this passage. Okay, so he does that. He prepares himself, and then he has to go and consecrate the temple. Consecrate, by the way. What does consecrate mean? To make holy. Right? We have lots of different words in English that all mean the same thing. Consecrate, sanctify, and holy all mean holy. And I don't know if you knew that, but you should know that. And I don't know why we have all those different words. Okay, that's just silly. We should just call it holify. But whatever. So don't get scared when you hear consecrate, because consecrate just means make holy. And sanctify, when you hear that, just means make holy. Okay? Okay, so what he has to do then is consecrate the temple itself. Why does he have to do that? Because the temple, that's very close. So the temple has been living in the midst of a sinful people. The temple is not God, so some of the sin of the people has contaged, if you like, to the temple, right? So we're going to deal with that. Then he'll slaughter the goat for the sin offering, I'm in verse 15 of the people, and take his blood behind the curtain and do with it as he did with the bull's blood. He'll sprinkle it on the atonement cover and in front of it. But this time he doesn't have to do the whole thing with the incense, notice, because we've dealt with that problem. This time he can take the blood in and sprinkle it, right? Because now he's ready. He's ready for the presence of God. Okay, in this way he'll make atonement for the most holy place. In other words, all of the sin that's rubbed off the people because of the uncleanness and rebellion of the Israelites, whatever their sins has been. He's to do the same for the tent of meeting, which will be the holy place in the temple context, which is among them in the midst of their uncleanliness. Right? The people are unclean, so the temple needs to be purified. The temple needs to be holified. No one's to be in the tent of meeting from the time Aaron goes in to make atonement in the most holy place until he comes out, having made atonement for himself, his household, and the whole community of Israel. Then he'll come out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for that. He'll take some of the bull's blood and some of the goat's blood and put it on the horns of the altar. So things change a little bit by the time you get to the temple, but now we're talking about this altar. The horns of an altar, there are 4 pointy bits that stick up at the corners, and that's what's called the horns of the altar. He'll sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times to cleanse it, and to consecrate it from the uncleanliness of the Israelites. And when Aaron has finished making atonement, okay, so now what's he done? He's cleansed himself. He's ready for the presence of God. He's cleansed the temple. The temple is ready for the presence of God. When Aaron has finished making atonement for the most holy place, the tent of meeting and the altar, he can finally deal with everybody's sin. Because now all the bits that he needs to deal with sin are ready to deal with sin. Do you follow? We need the temple to deal with sin. We need Aaron to deal with sin. So everything that's ready, it's all good to go. He's ready. He's to lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites, all their sins, and put them on the goat's head, and then send the goat away into the wilderness in the care of someone appointed for the task. The goat will carry on itself all of their sins to a remote place, and the man will release it into the wilderness. And then everything from there is kind of done. That's how Israel, once a year, atone. They prepare themselves and they make themselves fit for the presence of the God who lives in their midst. So this is God providing a symbolic way and teaching Israel what it's going to take to overcome the problem of their sin. But gee, that's a schlep, right? Can you imagine? I mean, there are lots of things that are wrong with this system, and you don't need to be a theologian to see them. Can you figure them out for yourselves? Tell the person next to you something that's wrong with this system. Okay, give me something. The goat might come back. Fair enough, I mean. It's probably good it wasn't a pigeon. Yeah, sorry? Oh yeah, look, you can just send it off again, I guess. I don't know. It's not something I thought of, but I guess hypothetically the goat could come back. Okay, just explain that. That's right, that's true.
Well, it would probably only last even if it was real rather than symbolic.
Right, so that's the question. Does it actually work? Does it work? Hey? Temporarily, right, but if it was actually able to make you holy and fit for the presence of God, you wouldn't have to keep doing it. Right? So yeah, okay, it teaches you something about what it's going to take to get you back into the presence of God. But if it was actually able to do that, then it didn't do a very good job of it because you have to keep doing it over and over again. Right? Okay, so there's something, yeah?
The thing is, like, between everything, you have to keep washing yourself. So you clearly got, like, even within the process, it's so inefficient because at each step you're, like, dealing again with sin and stuff.
Right, I don't know, to be honest with you, whether it's set up for efficiency.
There's so much stuff that's unclean.
Right. Because in the whole system there are like 10 gazillion ways to get unclean. And there's very few ways to get clean again. Yeah, I completely agree with you.
The priest representing it are sinful.
Right, so you've got a priest who's trying to deal with your sin, but he has to deal with his sin. That's not a very good system. Okay. Is it actually possible that the blood of bulls and goats could pay for human sin? No. Sorry? It's okay, it's unfair on the animals. Again, I don't know if that's the primary concern. Fair enough. But
Also, you must wait the whole year for the process.
right, you don't actually have to. There are other sacrifices you can do in between. So this is kind of a big community event once a year that symbolises us as a people. But if you sin in between, there are ways to deal with that, and there are other sacrifices you can make. But I didn't obviously have time to go through the entire system with you. So you don't actually have to wait a whole year. But right, it's not actually, it doesn't really make sense. Where do we get the idea that blood should pay for sin? Well, it did come from God. Adam and Eve? Do you want to explain that?
God having to kill the first
preacher in order to play them.
Okay, there was that, remember? On the day you eat of it, you'll surely die. So there's already a connection right at the beginning between sin and death. And then God kills an animal in response to Adam and Eve's sin and gives them the garment to wear. There's actually a whole bunch of things that, there's a whole bunch of laws that are designed to teach Israel there's a connection between life and blood and sin and death. So they can't drink the blood of an animal. I don't know why you would want to, but you can't eat the blood. Do you know that? Because the blood is its life. Right? So there's a whole, as part of this system, there's already kind of a connection between sin and death and life and blood and all of that kind of going on already. So symbolically, it makes a lot of sense that the animal should die to pay for sin, symbolically. But really it should be us. Really it should be us. The Old Testament already knows that it's not really sacrifice that God wants from people. Psalm 40, Psalm 50, sacrifices I have not desired. Okay, even the Old Testament knows that it's not sacrifices. Symbols are important because they teach us something, but nothing here works.
Would it be, okay, I'm just thinking out loud, but would it make sense to say sin can't exist in God's presence so for it to disappear, it has to die. So it dies like through whatever is killed. So that sin kind of, by the death of the animal, that sin kind of has disappeared.
I do think there's something to that. I think it's a little more complicated. Notice on the Day of Atonement, where did the people's sin end up? On the head of the goat that went to the wilderness. That's something that always surprises Christians because we expect it should be the goat that dies. But it's not quite as simple as we'd like it to be sometimes. And I have so much I want to explain. I'm not going to because we're just going to be here all night and eventually Sandili's going to say I have to sit down and I would like to be finished by that time. But you guys can ask me later about why the sin on the goat, if that's interesting to you, and I will tell you all about it very happily. Okay, I think for now, did Mark? Yep.
It's symbolic.
Yes.
It would obviously make a difference in the sense that it didn't do it, they would die in the presence of God.
Right.
It didn't, so it did have it.
Right, because symbols have importance, right? And they have real life importance. We don't deal well with symbols sometimes in our cultures. Not all the time, we don't deal well with symbols. But, you know, what does the colour red mean to you?
Danger.
Danger, right. Do you know it doesn't mean danger to everybody in the world? If you go to China and say, what does the colour red mean? They'll tell you it's lucky.
Yeah.
That's why the Chinese flag is red. Right? For you, it's danger. It's arbitrary that it's danger, right? There's nothing about redness that automatically says danger. But if you don't stop at red lights, you're still going to get killed. Right? So symbols are important, and just because they're symbolic doesn't mean they don't work in the real world. Right? Okay, so we're learning to deal with the symbols of the temple. And what I'm saying is the message of the temple is quite clear. If you're an ancient Israelite, having the temple and having to do this kind of thing every time shows you lots. It shows you everything we've been learning. It shows you that God really wants to dwell in your midst and that is utterly and completely impossible. And it shows you what will be required of you to make your way back into the presence of God and how utterly unattainable that is for you. But there's hope to it. It's a promise. Okay, what would it take to actually deal with everybody's sin? I think you know the answer because here we are, but we're going to look at it anyway. What would it take to actually deal with everybody's sin so that we could actually walk into the holy place and boldly approach the throne of grace to find mercy and help in our time of need? We're about to, Sandili, we're about to. Why don't you come with me to the end of Hebrews chapter 9. Now, Hebrews is great for this question. If you don't know that already, then it's really worth your time. if you do know Hebrews, what I want you to do is just read it this time with the kinds of things we've been talking about in mind. So the argument of Hebrews, which has already been almost set up by this point, is that the temple is a shadow of what goes on in heaven. Yeah.
I have things underlined.
Oh, you have things underlined. Yeah, once you got to Hebrews. Yeah, nothing in Kings. Well, you know. Better than nothing. The whole argument of Hebrews, by the time you get here, is that there's a picture. The temple, the tabernacle actually is what Hebrews uses, is a picture of a true reality that's actually going on in heaven. So we'll start at verse 11. When Christ came as a high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that's not made with human hands. That is to say, is not a part of this creation. Okay, so the author of Hebrews is saying what's going on is the tabernacle, the temple, is a picture of a reality that is truly real, but not ours. It's in heaven. He didn't enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so they are outwardly clean. It makes them holy. That's what we've just been reading. How much more then, verse 14, will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. The argument is that Jesus is doing, in reality, what the high priest, Aaron, was doing symbolically. Do you follow? Jesus is doing, in reality, what the high priest Aaron was doing symbolically. Notice that he also cleanses by his blood the sanctuary. Verse 23. I'm just going to skip down a little bit. It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. It was necessary for these copies. This is a copy of what's going on up there. It was necessary for these to be sanctified, made holy, with sacrifices. We just read about that. But the heavenly things with better sacrifices. For Christ didn't enter a sanctuary made with human hands. That was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Notice, if you enter the sanctuary, you end up in God's presence. And it's saying, okay, where did Christ go? Christ entered the sanctuary that's really there in heaven and went into God's presence to appear for us. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that's not his own. Okay, you picked up that problem. I didn't even have to tell you about it, right? No, but Christ didn't do that. Otherwise, Christ would have to have suffered many times since the creation of the world. And that was your point. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many and will appear a second time not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. The whole argument here is that Jesus is doing, in reality, what the high priest was doing in symbol. So if you want to know about what Jesus has done for you, the temple is actually a really good place to learn that. Okay, we're going to keep reading into Hebrews 10. Is that okay? We're not going much longer, so I know it's towards the end of the evening. Bear with it. We're nearly done, actually. The law is only a shadow. So by the law, it means everything we've been talking about, the temple, the sacrifices, everything. The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the reality themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifice repeated endlessly year after year, that was another problem we noticed, it can never make perfect those who draw near to worship. It just can't do it. Otherwise, otherwise, would they not have stopped being offered? That was our point. If it makes you perfect, why do you have to keep doing it? Obviously, it didn't make you perfect. Otherwise, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshippers would have been cleansed once and for all and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins. What did the sacrifices end up doing in the temple for Israel? Because he had to do them over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. It just kept going, hey, you guys have been sinful this year. And then a year later, we did it again, here we are. No, it's an annual reminder over and over for sins. Those sacrifices are an annual reminder. It's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. I'm just going to skip down again to verse 11. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. He walked into the holy place. Where is the throne of God? God sits enthroned on the cherubim. But this is a symbol of a true reality. And Jesus enters into the holy place, sits down at the right hand of the throne of God, and since that time awaits for his enemies to be made a footstool. For by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. And that's you, and that's me. For by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. What do you need to do now to be fit to enter the presence of God? Nothing. You need to do nothing. For by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. There is nothing left to do. There is nothing you can do. You are fit for God's presence. Look at where the logic leads to in Hebrews. Look at verse 19. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place, the place that Aaron couldn't go except once a year, since we have confidence, we can just walk right in there to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened up for us through the curtain. What's it talking about through the curtain? Yeah, it's talking about that curtain. But do you remember when Jesus died? That curtain tore from top to bottom. By a new living way opened up for us through the curtain, that is his body. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience and having our bodies washed with pure water. What do you need to do to enter the presence of God? You need to be washed, you need to be cleansed, you need to be sanctified, you need to be purified, you need to be made holy. What has Christ done for you? You were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in Jesus Christ. Consider what Jesus has done to bring you into fellowship with God. Consider how much God must have wanted to be in fellowship with you. Consider what it cost God, the death of his Son, to be in fellowship with you. And consider the access that you have to the throne of grace whenever you want it. No condemnation now I dread. Jesus and all in him is mine. Alive in him, my living head, and clothed in righteousness divine, bold, I approach the eternal throne and claim the crown of Christ, my own. Why don't we pray? Father, thank you for our great high priest. Thank you for his sacrifice, for his blood that was shed for us. Thank you for the new and living way that opened up for us so that we can find access to you, so that we can call out, Abba, Father. Give us confidence to approach you in our times of need. Give us peace that we have been washed and sanctified and made holy. And give us encouragement to live together as a people holy to you. We ask in Jesus' name.